All right. Welcome, everybody, to Re-Envisioning Publicly Engaged Scholarship in Promotion and Tenure. We're really excited to have you all with us on this Monday, starting off the week with a really great topic. My name is Elaine Ikeda. I am the Executive Director of Lead California. And I'm excited to be joined in collaboration with Lauren Wendling from Collaboratory and Leslie Garvin, the Executive Director of North Carolina Campus Engagement. And all of us wanted to collaborate in bringing this interesting and challenging topic to you all in this first webinar, which will be kicking us off in a series of other conversations, which we'll talk more about at the end here. But to get started, okay, I thought I could advance here. Let me just. I'm having trouble advancing the slide. There we go. If those of you who have joined can take a moment and share in the chat your name, your institution or your organization, what you do at your organization or campus, and any question that you might have about recognizing community engagement in promotion and tenure. We did ask you that question in the registration form. And so we're excited about the number of you who provided some really interesting questions, and we'll hopefully be answering many of your questions, or at least having a discussion about your questions during the Q&A section, as well as integrating it into our conversation today. So a very brief overview. We're going to start with a little bit of framing and introducing you to our panelists. Then we're going to have a moderated panel discussion focusing on some of the foundational and grounding ideas around this work from our panelists, some of the processes that go into thinking about influencing tenure and promotion, and then also looking ahead at what we all think needs to be done, what we'd like to see happen. And then we'll have time, hopefully, for some audience Q&A. And my colleague Leslie will be moderating the chat throughout this and pulling your best questions out to ask to our panelists. And then we'll close with talking about the next steps. We are going to keep you muted throughout this, as we have over 60 people participating, and we're really honored to have your presence. But just to make sure we don't get background noise and so forth, we're going to keep you muted. So with that, I just want to say a little bit about how this conversation came to be. You know, I've been doing community engagement work for over 20 years, and I have to say there have been many times in the past 20 years that I've been in the work that we've had conversations about promotion and tenure. And I was actually talking with Bemi at UCLA, who is probably on this call, Friday, about how, you know, maybe it's cyclical, but we're not really feeling like we've made huge progress. And at recent conferences, I've been fortunate to be a part of some conversations with some of the people who are going to be your panelists here, but talking about tenure and promotion and tenure. And then just Leslie and I also had conversations. We know there's folks in our states that are really trying to do this work as well. So we decided to pull together a wonderful group of panelists. Dr. Emily Janke, who's the Associate Professor of Peace and Conflict Studies and the Director of the Institute for Community and Economic Engagement at UNC Greensboro. And Dr. David Donahue, a Professor of Education at University of San Francisco, and Dr. Timothy Eatman, Dean of the Honors Living Learning Community at Rutgers University. All of these folks have either done research, have put together guides, have done lots of presentations, on promotion and tenure and related topics, and also have coached a lot of other faculty in their faculty portfolios as they go up for tenure. And then also they have served on promotion and tenure committees within their own colleges or so and so forth. So they bring a lot of experience, thoughtfulness about this topic, and I think you're going to find this to be a really enriching conversation. So with that, I'm going to stop talking and turn it over, and the panelists will say a little bit more about themselves as they introduce as we get going forward. But I am going to turn it over now to my colleague Lauren Wendling, who will get us started here.
All right, thanks, Elaine. Thank you everyone for joining. Good morning to you all. I'm super excited to be a part of this webinar and to work so closely with all of the folks that helped to put it together. I have the wonderful privilege of being able to moderate and ask questions of our wonderful panelists. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of it all, I want to share a little bit about my background and what makes me so excited about this conversation. I serve as the Director of Institutional Success at Collaboratory. So that means that I get to work with a lot of campuses across the country, specifically around data collection, around community engagement. And one of those lines that data is needed and is used for is a lot about thinking through changes to P&T in terms of helping faculty, with their dossiers to present community engagement, thinking through guideline reform, metrics reform, just how can we as community engagement professionals influence our institutions to change P&T for the better, to better support, retain, reward engaged faculty. So that's my day job. I also am a recent graduate of IU University, or Indiana University, and my specific line of inquiry personally is around this topic of institutional change as it relates to promotion and tenure. So I am very excited to chat with our panelists, many of whom, or all of whom, I cited in my dissertation work. So just really excited to be here. We're going to kick things off we're going to kind of frame the discussion. We've got about 40 minutes. We're going to frame it in like 3 different categories or buckets. So first, we're going to think about some of the foundational aspects of this work. We'll move then more into kind of the nitty-gritty processes as of how, in what ways, and then we'll take some time to look ahead in terms of what are next steps, or what are some steps that campuses can and should take to enact change in these areas. So I'm going to put it to our panelists first as they kind of introduce themselves, or better introduce themselves in their context. We'll just ask the first kind of queued up question of how did this work start on your campus? So how are you positioned on your campus? And then how did this work for you and for your colleagues start? So I'll pass it first to Tim, and then maybe we can popcorn around to each presenter. So Tim, take it away.
Dr. Wendling, congratulations again on your successful defense and your great work. It is my great pleasure to be a part of this conversation with these esteemed panelists, and certainly Elaine and the Leslie and other leaders who are taking on a really important conversation. I'm Tim Eatman. I serve as a professor of urban education at Rutgers University, Newark, and I'm also the inaugural dean of the Honors Living Learning Community at Rutgers University, Newark. At Rutgers, it is not my bailiwick to weigh intensively in on issues around promotion and tenure, but had a pretty extensive opportunity to lead and engage with a national consortium called Imagining America, Artists and Scholars in Public Life, during which I did a good bit of work in that area in terms of research and connecting with a number of associations and campuses. And so I really come to the work, Lauren, from that perspective, having had a chance to engage with a number of institutions in that regard. And then in my own institution, when I was at Syracuse University, Imagining America was headquartered there under the leadership of Nancy Cantor, who is now at Rutgers, Newark. Yes, I did follow her there. And Imagining America is now headquartered at the University of California, Davis, under the able leadership of Dr. Erica Cole Arenas. We really couldn't be addressing a more important issue with respect to publicly engaged scholarship when we take on the question of faculty rewards. In fact, when you talk to some of the veterans in the area of publicly engaged work, like John Saltmarsh and others, they always remind us that the academic core of the institution is what keeps us rolling. And you know, students come and go, administrators come and go, you know, but the tenured faculty, right? I mean, this is really what is so important about you know, tending to the culture of the institution. We don't need to depress ourselves with the falling number of tenured and tenure track faculty that are actually at institutions right now. We know those numbers, 25% and less on many campuses. That's a whole nother conversation, but it does point to the importance of us focusing on that issue. I want to be brief in this initial question and really provoke us by asking us, how would we imagine that we could make cultural change within institutions of higher education and not use cultural practices? One of the things that my involvement with Imagining America, Artists and Scholars in Public Life, helped me, a quantitative sociologist whose socks roll up and down when I can explain variance, be more savvy and tuned into the tools that the humanities and the arts provide for us as we go about this cultural change, Lauren. And I think that just at this initial outset, I would love to just toss that in the air. I'm sure that my other colleagues will pick it up. And we can drill down more as we go forward. But I begin with posing that question.
Thank you, Dr. Eatman. Why don't we move now to Dr. Donahue? Would you like to introduce yourselves and talk a little bit about how the work initiated on your campus?
Thank you very much. I'll echo Tim's comments about what a pleasure it is to be here with this panel today and with you all. My name's David Donahue. I'm a professor of education at the University of San Francisco, and I'm maybe the oldest person on the panel, which means I've played a number of roles in higher ed. So I'll just share what some of those are, because all of them intersect in different ways with thinking about tenure and promotion and community engaged scholarship. So prior to being a professor of education at the University of San Francisco, I served as the director of the McCarthy Center for Public Service and the Common Good here for 5 years. And then prior to coming to USF, I was on the faculty at Mills College, which is now Mills College Northeastern. And I also served in the provost's office for 3 years at Mills, including 1 year as interim provost. In all those roles, I've intersected with tenure and promotion and the notion of community engaged scholarship. First as a faculty member at Mills, engaged in community engaged scholarship, going up for promotion and eventually getting associate professor and then full professor. I have been connected to it through the provost's office, where in my role as interim provost, I would have to present to the board of trustees the candidates for promotion on the faculty and explain their scholarship. At both Mills and at USF, I have served on the promotion and tenure committees. At Mills, I served on the promotion and tenure committee for the entire college. For 2 years, I was chair of it. At USF, I am currently on the peer review committee for the School of Education, and will be cycling on to the university-wide tenure committee. And at all of these levels, I've been thinking about what it means to be an advocate for community engaged scholarship And I think my experience around community engaged scholarship is very much shaped by the fact that I've spent my entire career in education at small, teaching-focused liberal arts colleges that are very mission-driven. Mills College was a women's college. USF is a Jesuit college with a very strong tradition of service. And I think that has shaped my approach in terms of where the work begins. When I first came to USF as the director of the McCarthy Center, some of my colleagues and I thought we should really work to institutionalize community engaged scholarship more in the actual guidelines for promotion and tenure. USF is a unionized institution where the faculty are unionized. So if we're to make any kind of change, it actually goes into the collective bargaining agreement, which adds in a whole nother layer of change. But before we even started to think about how we would maybe do that work, we thought, let's just talk to people and what their experience has been. And I see one of my colleagues, Star Plaxton Moore, has entered the chat. And is here today too, because she knows this story well. We started to talk to folks on campus, including the person who was then the current chair of the Promotion and Tenure Committee. And we were receiving messages about how it really wasn't a problem in terms of community engaged scholarship being looked down upon or not counted as real scholarship or not having rigor or value. And I think that shaped where we've gone since in terms of thinking about how to promote community engaged scholarship in the tenure process. Tim mentioned culture, and I think we've focused as much on shaping the culture and thinking about who's at the table in terms of tenure and promotion as much as the actual policies. So I'll just stop there for now. Thanks so much.
Thank you, David. And we'll move now to Dr. Janke.
Thanks so much, Lauren, and thank you, Leslie and Elaine, for inviting me to this panel. I'm Emily Janke. I direct the Institute for Community and Economic Engagement, and I have been at UNC Greensboro since 2008. And so my PhD is in higher education. I studied community-university partnerships. So I came at this from a level of always coming into this career wanting to help institutions do better jobs, reaching inwards as well as outwards, thinking about how do we work with mutually beneficial and reciprocal relationships, and what does that even look like? And so I was gifted very early on to get to know Timothy Eatman, Dr. Timothy Eatman. Thank you. It's good to see you. And that has really shaped a lot of the work that we have been doing here at UNCG in terms of thinking about connections to community engagement and how do we think about this more inclusively, and what does that nexus look like in terms of inclusive excellence and community engagement, and how we think about the spectrum of scholarly artifacts and products, and that if we're serious about community engagement, really taking in different perspectives, then we also have to honor the ways that they come to us, and that we don't need to necessarily convert them into some sort of academic ease. And so Tim shares about that much more eloquently, but that's been a lot of the work that we've been doing. So I came in 2008, and for 4 years worked around the service learning side, thinking about curricular engagement, and then, well, 2 years did that, and then 2 years came into the research side of things. And then in 2013 became the director of the Institute and also an associate professor in peace and conflict studies. And in that role, I've had, being a scholar administrator has given me perspectives that I wouldn't have otherwise had on this promotion and tenure thing. One is the absolute essential role, and we can talk about this more later, about staff and administrative staff supporting this work kind of from the middle out. And so there's a place for everybody in this movement. And so wanting to recognize and honor that. And I've also done this work from a faculty position, which has allowed me to be on promotion and tenure committees for colleagues in my department, and also to be in the School of Health and Human Sciences at that school level of review. And so I've served there for 5 years. And so that's given me important perspectives. And then working on different kinds of committees, looking at promotion and tenure. The Faculty Senate right now has a committee There's some folks on this call who are on that committee, and it's looking at diversity, equity, and inclusive excellence and promotion and tenure. And so learning about the culture and community organizing that we needed to do around community engagement, and also some of these connections. And so we've been on some of these calls that have been looking at that specifically. So just real briefly in terms of how this work started on our campus. So I came in 2008, and that was also the first time that UNCG was classified as a community engaged institution by Carnegie. It was also the year that we had strategic planning going on for a 2009-2014 university strategic plan. And it was also the year that we had an ad hoc committee established in the Faculty Senate to talk about promotion and tenure and community engagement. So there was this real confluence of events that happened. Such that promotion and tenure policy was revised in 2010 to include recognition of community engagement in the teaching, research, and creative activity sections, as well as service. So it's embedded throughout the different sections rather than a fourth category, which is how some do it, or just a general statement. And so a lot of that work that we have done has been around supporting our faculty who did this work to actually make sure that this lives on, not only that to change that university policy, but we also at our campus, we're not unionized, and we do have policies at each of the colleges and the schools. There's 7 of them, and then each of the departments also have policies. And so a lot of our work and a lot of our story and lessons learned have been about how do you do this work so that it's deep, pervasive, and integrative across the institution policies. And then how does that look for practice? So I think that's helpful context to understand a little about our institution and how we started.
Yeah, thank you all. I think it's very helpful context to know how you all are approaching it differently, and recognizing that it's not a one size fit all, approach that campuses can take. That I love what you had said about it being a grassroots movement, that sometimes that's a more sustainable way for campuses to go. Sometimes a top-down approach is better, depending on your institutional mission and context. So in terms of your experiences at your individual campuses, could you speak a bit more to a kind of I don't want to put these against each other, but is it more, or were you more accustomed to a grassroots approach, or more of a top-down kind of approach? Or would that be, you use terms grassroots, community organizing, and also had spoken about how your individual identities obviously put you in different places for this work. So we'll talk about engaging other stakeholders a bit later, but big picture from your individual institutions or different campuses, could you speak a little bit more about what approach worked best? Did you try multiple approaches, and how were they received? So we'll pass it to David first here.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that whole question about top-down, grassroots, I feel like both institutions where I've been, the work has been very much grassroots. I think changing the policies matter. And I think just being a little bit daunted by that process at a place where it's subject to the collective bargaining agreement, we focused a little bit more on shaping the culture and thinking about who was at the table. So I know, within the School of Education, we think very carefully about who's going to run for the promotion and tenure committee, and who will be there. And are they people engaged in community engaged scholarship? Are they people who can advocate for it? And are they people who can remind their colleagues at the table about the value and rigor of this, given what we already have in our collective bargaining agreement? So there are things in our guidelines for promotion and tenure that do talk about the impact of scholarship, and how scholarship that is not just in a traditional mode can be valued. And so I think having people at the table who can actually really talk about that and really explain that to other colleagues has been really key. I also think just reminding people about the mission of this institution and how the work that community engaged faculty and scholars are doing on our campus really fits with the mission of this institution. I will say that particularly at USF, there is such a strong mission here about service, which I think comes from being a faith-based institution, and that may be the case for others, faculty going up for tenure at faith-based institutions, that calling on that mission of service, that service means not just, one leg of the stool, but it's also about a kind of scholarship. It's about a kind of teaching, and that should be valued. So I think, that's been very much part of the process here. I would never rule out working on the policy, but I think right now it's very much a grassroots effort, and making sure that the people who are going up for tenure and promotion who are doing this work are represented by folks around the table.
Tim, Emily, would you like to chime in? I'll let you all kind of hop in when you want to.
Sure. Thanks a lot, David. I think those are really important points. Lauren, I want to go back to your question about the kind of organizing approach on the campus. So at Syracuse, we had the good fortune of having Nancy Cantor, and she challenged the faculty. She said, what does scholarship in action look like? And what do we need as a 21st century institution to really help us demonstrate the power of publicly engaged work? But you can't pose that kind of question without having an abiding belief in the reality that our institutions were not designed to embrace publicly engaged scholarship. And that's just real. Like, what is our metaphor? It's the ivory tower. You all can unpack that. That's a solipsistic celebration of being removed from community, right? Like, that's what that is. So it was really powerful to have a leader to say, hey, this is what I want the challenge to be, and to invite faculty, and many of which who had been doing different kinds of work, but kind of really needed permission to have these conversations and to develop town halls and to share their work and to invite an acknowledgement of the intellectual power of community-based partners, and to really hone in on what I believe to be true. And I think many here also believe to be true. Publicly engaged scholarship makes our work better, period. Full stop, drop the mic. It makes our work better for faculty. It makes our work better for students who have the opportunity for hands-on work. Dr. Janke mentioned the challenge of fragmenting out engaged scholarship. People read Boyer, for good reason, as establishing like a fourth area of scholarship, when really, there are a lot of debates around, his desire really to emphasize engagement across the faculty roles. That's not a new category, right? And, we got to really, I'm so less impressed with development of policy. Yeah, we need the policy, we need the rubrics. I think it's really critical for us to share. And, Dr. Benyon shared several links in the chat, which I think are so useful. One, which comes from my own institution. But I really think, Lauren, that when we're taking up this question, whether it's a challenge from on up above, or whether it's the kind of community organizing among faculty that David and Emily mentioned, that we would put in center what some of the challenges are for this work. I'll end by saying that I was working in a national context with Imagining America on this tenure team initiative on public scholarship, and actually came to the institution that Nancy Cantor was. And I was a pre-tenure faculty member. And she said, well, you need to join the Academic Affairs Committee of the Senate because they're taking this work up. And I said, my mother taught me that you don't go to anyone's house and change their rules. Are you inviting me to join the Academic Affairs Committee of the Senate as a pre-tenure faculty member, and they're developing these policies. And she insisted, and I did. And it was an interesting, long process. I often talk about this when I coach institutions, but at the end, it was the faculty, the senior faculty members who took seriously this promise that publicly engaged scholarship makes our work better. I'm still mystified that I was tenured at that institution. I was the third Black man in 106 years that was tenured at that institution in the School of Education. That's a fact. And so there are all these questions around, and that's not because I'm so smart, right? I love the life of the mind, but I could go 125th Street in Harlem where I live and gather up people of all backgrounds who could do this work. But when we think about the traditions of the academy, the metaphors, the deep need that we need to have to expand our understanding of what knowledge making is, we need to have in the middle of that, these questions of access and diversity and inclusion. But I'm rambling now. My apologies.
Never rambling. I love it. So when I think about the change, I talked about the grassroots movement. And so I just want to really emphasize that point on our campus at UNCG. It was the faculty. I came in 2008. It was already a conversation. There were learning communities of folks. There was a service learning faculty fellow who chose as her project. She had one course buyout. Spomi Ivanovich chose as her project to look at promotion and tenure. And then she wrote a letter to her dean and made the case for why we need to consider this. That went forward to faculty senate. There were the chair-elect as well as the chair at the time were interested and committed to this. They put it on the agenda. They created a faculty senate. And so I got to come and observe this. So as somebody who is staff member, I went to faculty senate and watched, and I documented, and I wrote, and I learned. And then I made connections to those folks. And I said, hey, just so you know, there's all these folks that are working on this also. And there are all these other kinds of connections that we should be making also. And so that was a real opportunity to be able to, as sort of like a manager level, right, middle level person, to be able to come around with a lot of support and say, like, this is literally my job, is to think about how we institutionalize community engagement in a good way. We make it sticky so it stays. And I see that you're doing this good work. And so that's where I became an ally with those individuals and thought about what are the kinds of efforts that we can do. And so one of it was just connecting them to the national conversation, which included inviting speakers from across the nation who are doing this work to talk about their scholarship, to talk about it administratively. We also did interviews with, so Faculty Senate gave us some funding to work with another scholar, a faculty fellow, to interview. I think we interviewed 14 faculty who are community engaged scholars about their experiences with promotion and tenure, pre-tenure and post-tenure. And so we could reflect back what we were doing. So Judith Romali talks about change as a scholarly act, and I took her seriously. And so we studied it, we documented it. And so I want to share too that now I hear lots of folks kind of in conversations about like who needs to initiate change. I hear often the presidents and provosts say that they're waiting for reform, or the calls for reform have to come from faculty, right? So I think Nancy was brave and she had a vision and she made it, and like she created a path at Syracuse University. And at UNCG, it wasn't, we did have a change of leadership at that time. And it was actually the faculty who said, this is who we are, this is what we want to be known for. And so in our case, it did come from the grassroots, but I often hear faculty even now at UNCG who might feel a little bit, and we got to talk more about, now that we've had promotion and tenure in our policy for 12 years, so what, or 13 years now, I guess, that there are still folks saying, hey, we need this senior leadership to understand this, to recognize it. And they kind of point up. And it's often the senior leadership pointing down and saying, well, they need to request it. They need to call for it because we can't do this without them. And so it really is all the levels. And so I'm in peace and conflict studies now as my tenure home. And John Paul Lutterock is a peace scholar who talks about the importance of middle level actors. And so I'll put this in the chat. And so I've thought about this a lot as it applies not to peace building, but to community engagement and kind of community organizing. And so my sense is that there are professionals. He talks about the middle out building, right? And so my sense is that there are professional staff often who are likely to know and be known by top level leadership. And yet they have the significant connections, the constituency that the top leaders claim to represent. And so these middle folks, and I feel like this has been my role, has been to serve as the important connection between the top and the grassroots level, helping to carry the message up and down to say their support, we can keep going forward. So there's no red herrings in terms of these other directions, these other rabbit holes where we say, oh, wait, but first we have to. And so I'm able to listen. And one of those things that came up for us pretty early on was, how are we defining community engagement? Because in our policy, the university-wide level policy names community engagement. It's in the policy. There's examples of outputs of what this might look like, but there's not a real definition that's talking about reciprocity, mutual benefit, partnerships, epistemic justice. Like there's none of that, right? And so part of what the provost and the deans asked when I was at that table was, hey, could we get some definitions? And so that's where I was able to then go back, because in that moment I could hear that request. I could then go back and work with some folks to look at and create definitions. And I'll put those also in the chat and some of the other resources I'm talking about, because I know that's being requested. So that was really helpful in terms of understanding that there are policies, and then there's the other supporting stuff, like the people who come and then live in the minds, right, and imagination of the faculty who saw those speakers and were inspired by them. But there's also the additional websites, documents, policies, and again, I'll put that up in a minute, that have really helped our folks to be able to avoid those red herrings, those rabbit holes where we say, oh, we have to address this before we can move on. And this helps us when we have new leadership to say, nope, we already talked about that. Welcome to our house, right? These are our rules. If you don't understand it, we've done a lot of work here, and here are the documents. And so I think at this point, it's really hard to tease out on our campus if this is top down, middle out, bottom up, right? Because it does feel pervasive, even as we still have some issues, right? So not a panacea, but yeah, so it's a different kind of story.
Yeah, I appreciate you, Emily, kind of outlining a lot of like the strategic steps you all have taken, and in the ways that you all are thinking about, you know, this is a layered approach. This is a multi-year, decade-long approach, right? It's not something that you can't change culture overnight, right? And I hear in reflecting on what you've all shared, I hear that it is absolutely essential to get those, what you call like middle level leaders or staff involved, is the essential role of staff on a campus, community engaged professionals who understand this work and can speak to those various levels, and to connect those different levels at the institution. I also think your point about defining community engagement, and that as it relates to P&T or just other areas of campus is absolutely essential. I heard a lot of you talk about centering faculty voice and ensuring that you have pre-tenure, post-tenure, you know, different voices in committees and those who are doing this work. One question that I have, and that we saw a lot reflected in some of the registrations for this session, is if you've got some stakeholders, a lot of stakeholders, you know, different people on board, maybe some who have drank the Kool-Aid, but some who just maybe aren't there yet. How would you all, I'm curious to hear you all reflect on how would you unite these different stakeholders that come from various areas of the institution? And then how do you and your campuses work to generate buy-in from those different types of stakeholders? So, you know, departments, heads, deans, other office or center leaders, how how are you working to generate buy-in? Because that seems where there's a lot of maybe initial passion and power on campus for this, but then when it tries to spread or to institutionalize, it kind of loses steam. So curious how you all would reflect on like the act of generating buy-in from those various different stakeholders. And I'll just let anyone who.
I don't want to talk out of turn. I'm going to, but I do want to punctuate something that Dr. Janke has said several times now. She has had the effrontery to name community organizing. That's what this work is. Now, I know, you erudite faculty and, advocating. No, this is organizing work, okay? If you meet an organizer, community organizer worth her salt, she can tell you the next 20 people that she's got a one-to-one with that she's going to use in her strategy to develop a sense of how she can work with them. Like this is that. Those middle sort of leaders that Emily talked about, those folks that are based in the community, the students that are influencing the process, that it really needs to come together in that kind of muscular way that we see community organizers develop conceptual maps, right? And Dr. Donahue, would you come to my brown bag? Nobody else think about no brown bag. But where's the action and where's the ask? right? Lauren, you mentioned earlier in your comments, or maybe it was Elaine, that we don't get enough traction going on. Like, all right, I'm gonna stop, man.
I'll just follow up on that thing. I do think I appreciate the model and the metaphor of community organizing. It very much is that work. And I think there's a lot of work in terms of just reaching out to folks. You talked about buy-in. And I think a lot of that is done through one-on-one conversation. And then a lot of it is bringing people together and creating kind of a momentum. While we haven't done any formal work at USF to change the actual tenure guidelines and the collective bargaining agreement, my colleague Star Plaxton Moore, who's here. And I did do a lot of work over 5 years to move the institution from a service learning requirement to a community engaged learning requirement. And that involved a lot of the same work that we've been talking about here in terms of reaching out to stakeholders, doing benchmarking, defining the terms, going to people both above and below, although I hate to think about who's above and below, but like leading from the middle, I think is a really appropriate way to be thinking about that. And in the process, I think, thinking about what is the narrative around community engaged learning. One of my goals has always been to change that narrative. I feel like the narrative that's out there, and one of the reasons we maybe are even having this webinar, is there's a narrative out there that it's a problem to go up for promotion and tenure if you're a community engaged scholar. And I want to change the narrative to, there are some problematic institutions that don't recognize community engaged scholarship, and we need to change those institutions, as opposed to think about like all the ways that we package and do everything and apologize or whatever as community engaged scholars going up for tenure, especially because I think there are a number of institutions where even if the policies aren't in place, there is a lot of openness to community engaged scholarship, again, at institutions that are very mission driven and institutions that are very much focused on teaching. They may be different from the R1s. The interesting thing is a lot of us as faculty and administrators and people in higher, we came from R1s where we heard that message all the time that doing community engaged work is problematic if you're going up for tenure. My dissertation chair, who I love and was very well-meaning, I remember told me, you're gonna have a really hard time getting tenure doing community engaged scholarship. And, I like to think I've proven him wrong.
Well, thank you all. We're nearing the ends of the discussion. We've got about 15 minutes left, so I'm going to pass it to my wonderful colleague Leslie, who's going to queue up some like participant or audience Q&A. So I've seen some questions come through the chat, but if you all have any questions that have been sparked by this discussion, please feel free to enter them, and Leslie will try to get to them now, or maybe we can do some follow-up later. And while Leslie's queuing that up, I'm going to ask each of our panelists, not necessarily to respond, but to think about maybe one little concise nugget of advice that you would send folks off with as we leave the Zoom room for any different stage of this work or any different position, but just some type of a piece of advice that you would give to folks. So you can get your brains rolling on that. And Leslie, I'll pass it over to you.
Yes, first of all, let me say this has been so enriching and powerful, and I love the language of the culture change that's needed, and the call to not back down when we're hearing about the resistance and using terms like community organizing. And so maybe I'm the one who has to put I have to ask the very targeted, specific questions. People always want some more nuts and bolts that arrived in advance of this conversation. And so one of the questions that showed up several times, and you've alluded to it definitely, Emily in particular, when you talked about inclusive excellence, but there were a lot of folks wondering, how do you make the link between promotion and tenure, community and publicly engaged scholarship, and DEI, and the call for transformation of the culture in that way. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about ways or strategies that you're doing or using.
And I feel like Tim has certainly given me a master class in this, 10 years ago in thinking about this. So I'll share a little bit. The way that I think about it now is around epistemic justice and thinking about how do we include all the knowledge that is out there, especially as the forms of scholarship are rapidly expanding, from blogs to data sets, right, to artistic creations, as we're really thinking about beyond, but including books and peer-reviewed journal articles. We need to do a better job understanding that there are many ways of knowing things and expressing knowledge and generating knowledge. And for me, it's really at that level of, it seems absurd to me that we are just prioritizing and privileging certain ways of knowing, when we know our kids are doing things differently than we are, and they're doing just fine, and we're learning so much from them. And so I really do feel like I've heard other people talk about modernizing scholarship. That also feels very relevant. And so for me, it is about racial justice. It is about thinking about ways that we are more inclusive, but it's also just about the world is bigger than we've seen it in the academy. And so I'll share some links to some articles we've been looking at, and I don't want to take too much time, but essentially when we're looking at our P&T policy for community engagement, looking at how was it described if it wasn't defined, and does that actually help us have a transformative policy if we haven't described it as mutually beneficial, reciprocal engagement, equity, those kinds of principles in there. What we identified is that really for community engagement and our policies to be transformative, we need to be including not only outputs of what kinds of artifacts can be created, but we also need to be talking about the process in which this work occurs, the relationships and the diverse knowers that do this work. So process and also outcomes. Why are we doing this work? And it is to make an impact on our communities that's positive, right? To help increase learning and readiness for our youth. So if we just think about only outputs and we don't talk about process and outcomes, then our policies are going to continue to be pretty thin in terms of its ability to really transform and expand our idea of inclusive excellence.
Thanks, Emily.
I have to say that the research that sort of grew out of the Tenure Team Initiative on Public Scholarship with Imagining America was focused on the importance, the level of attention that we play to diverse knowledges, as Dr. Janke just said, and to, led to the development of a framework that we call full participation. I put the link to the report, the co-written report in the chat, which I think is very helpful, and it includes a case study at the end that can be used, for conversation, with community, the community of organizers at our institution, and I think that it has to be really intentional, that we need to, as Emily has said, make sure that we're creating space for thinking about the process and recognizing what we're working against, and that a lot of people really have limited knowledge in this area. It's almost like, you're taught to, you're expected to teach because you're a PhD. Like, well, who taught you how to teach? You don't know how to teach. You know what I'm saying? So, we put these dossiers in front of, natural scientists and psychologists, and we've not, respected them enough, frankly, respected ourselves enough to do the kind of organizing that would position us to be able to surface these issues. And again, I just return to the importance of cultural practices for organizing in this regard. If you conduct a story circle before a promotion and tenure meeting, you have a different set of policy. Why? Because you're going to learn about a whole lot. You're going to learn about those sisters that are childbearing age that are just as smart as anybody else, but they don't have an opportunity. You're going to learn about the networks of the old boys who can get in certain journals and others can't. You're going to, you follow what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. And so, I think it's really, really critical for us to step back, and understand, as Bob Bringle says, and I put it in the chat as well, policies don't vote. We can get all policies together that we want to, but we really have to do the educating, and something that Dr. Berkey in her chat a little bit ago referred to is figure out how we invite an illumination of different work happening, not only in disciplinary associations at other institutions. I like to shame institutions. Who are your aspirational peers? What are they doing? Oh, right. Dr. Janke mentioned the Carnegie Engagement Classification, which is really increasing in its robustness about these issues.
Thank you, Tim.
I'll just add to that. I was thinking sometimes what a closed loop the whole tenure and promotion system is, where we put together these packets and then outside experts evaluate them. And so thinking about which voices are also chiming in terms of diverse knowledges, diverse perspectives. One of the things that I think is really effective is when faculty have been able to, garner other kinds of testimonials to the impact of their work. One way to measure impact is number of views of your article. I've clicked on a number of articles by mistake, and I suppose that counts as a view. So, I always question, like, what does that mean? But there are ways in which I think people in community have written and testified very strongly in terms of impact. And again, that plays an educational role in terms of people thinking about what this work means to people outside of the academy too.
Yeah, but just to build on that, we have to see those knowledge makers, as consequential. Oh my goodness.
No, Tim, this is great. One of the questions is, and you're about to go there, how do we ensure that community partner voice is part of this process? Please finish your thought.
No, I'm just saying, you mean the provost cannot write a letter to the community partner who has firsthand knowledge of what's happened and invite the kind of letter that can be used in the dossier? Really? That doesn't make sense. Who are the people that are closest to the learning? And because he doesn't have a PhD, come on. This is beneath us, colleagues. This is beneath us. we can do a much, much better job with that. And also with the acknowledgement of a variety of scholarly artifacts. I mean, you know, I've been resisting sharing this conceptual model that I often use, because I don't want people to get scared thinking I'm going to spend a whole lot of time on it, you know. But this question of definitions, you know, of what engaged scholarship is and what it looks like is so important for us, you know, to be able to recognize with respect to how engaged scholarship, you know, works and what it hinges on. You know, this idea of scholarly products, and, you know, how we understand, you know, for example, the range of products that can happen, you know, like, for example, the graphic novel in dissertation form that Nick Souzanis from San Francisco State created a few years ago when he was a doc student in the Imagining America network. Like we can really, we're in the 21st century, y'all.
Wonderful. Does anyone else want to say anything more about the elevating community voice in the process? I think that you've all spoken to that really well. I believe that Lauren was going to jump in with a question.
Yeah, just to in thinking also in a lot of questions that I've fielded or thought through with other campuses, and that also have come through the registrations for this specific webinar, that kind of goes back to, or does go back to what you all were saying in terms of community voice, and how are we evaluating or understanding the processes, the products of this work. I'm curious, could you all speak a bit about like the evaluative metrics that engaged faculty come to when it comes to P&T? If you've changed guidelines, I think that's one thing. The next hurdle or step I understand to be the change or evolution of evaluative metrics, and how engaged scholarship or research differs from traditional scholarship and research. And I think that's a sticking point for some campuses. If you can change, or you can fully define engagement, you can change guidelines, you can get a lot of that like grassroots collective, you know, power. But at the end of the day, if you go back to evaluate engaged scholarship through the lens of traditional research, it often it just doesn't match up, right? It doesn't align. You don't, or aren't able to value partner voice. You are looking at impact factors. So I would love if any of you would be able to speak to how you or your campuses might be thinking about the metrics by which school or department committees are looking at their colleagues' dossiers. And are you there yet? Is that kind of on the roadmap? Yeah, I'll put that to anyone.
I can share just a little bit. I think metrics are always tricky because there are, because what I think what is most important is the narrative and the ways in which faculty members help others to understand how they know they've been successful. What was their aim as a scholar? And what is it that, as they are looking at the impacts that they will have, how do they know that they've had those outcomes? And so for community engaged scholars, you're often treating your P&T dossier and the committees that are reviewing you as though they don't know anything about your scholarship. And that may be true if you're also a qualitative researcher, right, who has a lot of quantitative researchers. So it's something that the burden is on you to tell your story about how you know you're doing quality work, and that your questions and methods align and make this the best possible work you can do. And so I often talk about how it is that community engagement as a methodology allows you to do something that you couldn't do otherwise. So to be able to understand the perspectives of these individuals in this particular way, you have to include them, and that this is a way, and what that would take. So often it is about the narrative of how this work is also interconnected. My teaching, my research, and my service, I can't really pull them apart, even though you got those 3 buckets and you want me to do that. So it is always like bringing them together and talking about the integrated nature of this work and how it builds on one another. And then that helps them to read the CV or the products that come up. And so when there are things like there are talks, right, given at the library, or there is a policy brief right? Or you've been seen as a national expert, right? Being asked by these folks to give your time in your university role, right? To even do this work. That those things are eminence measures. They show us how the university is making a difference. And if I were not here, somebody would notice, and these people would notice. And so I have had, and then there's also sometimes letters of support from a community member or from someone who's talking about the impact on their profession, on their community, in their network, whatever it might be. And so again, I think that the metrics, we can get into the nitty gritty and spend 2 hours on this, but I do think the most important thing is helping the folks understand why you think you're successful. And then so they can read the CV with the correct kind of lens in the way that you need to, because then they can't really argue with you if you're saying what your aim is and you show them that linear, or maybe not linear, circular progression towards your aim. I'll stop there.
I love that answer. I think I share with Emily that, you can have metrics, but it's all about making a case, because unless the metrics just boil down to counting things, which I don't think anybody's metrics boil down to that, because that would be an oversimplification and do an injustice to evaluating scholarship. Things are always open to interpretation. And so people need to make the case. I also feel, and this is where I've just felt called, and I put out a call to people here who are faculty to run for promotion and tenure so that they can also help make the case within the conversations that are happening in promotion and tenure committees. I find on promotion, at least the promotion and tenure committees that I've served on, people tend to be very generous in terms of thinking about their colleagues, but also then very critical and analytical too. And so as we were talking, I was just thinking, so what does the collective bargaining agreement at USF say about this? What's our metric, in other words? And it mentions in terms of scholarship, similarly, in some instances, a significant practical application of already established scholarly knowledge may be considered within a school or college as a very effective form of scholarly activity. And so, it's about helping colleagues on a tenure and promotion committee think about, what does that mean? How does this work that we're looking at fall into that category? How is it excellent by that standard? And so I think there's the individual person going up, making the case. And then I think it's incumbent on people who are also around the table to be helping elucidate their colleagues about what is excellent community engaged scholarship too.
Great, thank you. So there were quite a few questions, and then I just saw something pop up in the chat. And this is an observation that I have been making here in the great state of North Carolina. And that is that we had a moment as a field around community engagement and publicly engaged scholarship. We have grassroots organizers like Emily and others, great administrators who have made shifts and changes on their campus. But there was a real sense in some of the questions that we're at a different moment right now in terms of some of the external pressures on higher education, particularly post-pandemic. And so I'd be interested in hearing anything you've been thinking about, anything that's been surfacing for you in terms of all the, we're having a lot of cuts and we're having a lot of challenges with enrollment. And how do we keep the momentum for the great work that we've built around this, knowing that we're trying to transform our institutions in a real way to transform our communities in partnership? Any thoughts on that? I just really want to surface that because I'm hearing it. I'm hearing a real, folks who've been doing this work for a long time feeling less valued and appreciated. And then we have this new group of scholars coming in with the passion and with the intention and the desire up against these forces. And so since you all are veterans and legends, I thought you might have some thoughts about this.
Veterans and legends, Does that mean I'm old? I don't know.
It means you're seasoned and
Yeah,
full of
okay.
grace.
I'll take that. You know, what you're raising is very real, right? I mean, like we have a whole different work situation at all of our institutions, and for a whole bunch of reasons. And I'm just finding that people are getting more intentional about purpose and their work, and they're not playing around. My thing is, let's focus on the stuff that makes our knowledge making and our scholarship better. Like, and that, yeah, we need our bench chemists, right? We can't navigate the natural world without them, right? But don't we need the chemists that look at lead in the water, right? I mean, don't we need, scholars that are don't we need the ability to think about the continuum of knowledge making and give the agency to faculty to locate themselves along the continuum of knowledge making where they choose to be? I mean, I think that's the reason I got a PhD. Somebody said, look, you can choose your area, right? And so we're in a right position as institutions to strategically develop those kinds of relationships and sort of perspectives about how we enter the work and whose voices get to register within that work.
Thank you, Tim.
I think I've been hearing a lot, you talk about like budget cuts and crisis and things like that. And I think on our campus and with our study of 21 faculty, 10 of which I think were non-tenure track or academic professional track, as we call them on our campus, they can go through promotion, right, from assistant to associate to full professor. And so we include them in our study because we wanted to understand what it was like to be at a community engaged institution, and were we walking the talk when we recruited them to come here? How are we doing? And one of the findings that came up that was unexpected was really around no matter what we're doing in the institution around community engagement, the budget conversation is going to have a real impact on how they feel aligned with institution or not. And so they are making sense of their community engagement and their own identities as their conversations on campus, talking about what do we care about? What is the most important thing? And so for some of these folks, they felt like, I don't want to do I don't want to do community engagement anymore because this institution doesn't really seem to be valuing our academic professional track folks, right? We feel very vulnerable to being let go, right? So a lot of this conversation is related to budgets and getting serious about what are we valuing if we have to start to value some things more than others because we can't say yes to everything. And so I would just say that this does feel, Leslie, like a really vulnerable, important time as we're going through this. And I also see it, as Tim has said, that there are folks who are saying, you know what, I'm going to be here and I'm going to outlast all this. And so I'm going to create the world that I want to live in, which is a community engaged world where I'm going to be doing meaningful work. And so I really see, I think we're going to see folks stepping away from it because they don't feel like the institution is supporting them and that they therefore want to leverage their personal relationships to help the institution, right, to do this work. And there are other people who I think are really getting more committed and trying to figure out how they do this in the way that they feel proud about. So the budget thing, I think, is a huge issue. And so I don't have any solutions, but I do think that messaging is going to be really important. And that's probably also the community engagement folks coming together and having conversations about how do we make community engagement a distinctive advantage. I mean, one of the advantages is it's never been really well supported. And so we've always had to be really like frugal and, and community organizing, right? So it's hard to take it out when you haven't been funding it at the same level as other things. So I do think that's part of the deep, pervasive, and integrative model of organizational change. That again, I use the word sticky. Like, how do we like make this so it's hard to undo? And so I do think that that is one of our advantages as scholars in this field.
I love your use of the word sticky, Emily, and trying to stick it to all the different places or people or things on a campus. And this is something, I guess I don't necessarily use the word sticky, but do have a lot of conversations with folks across the field within their specific institutional context and looking at how can you make community engagement, P&T, all of the things we've been talking about, how can you make that more holistic across your campus and recognizing that it's not a silo thing, that it is deep and pervasive and intensive. And a lot of that kind of goes, at least to me, goes to where is the energy on your campus? Leslie, as you were mentioning, energy changes, right? Like pre-pandemic, post-pandemic, there's always a different kind of channel of energy in terms of funding or student retention or faculty, you know, all of the things. So I'm curious if you three could reflect on where the energy is maybe on your campuses or where you see that energy within the field, and that how can engagement be seen through that lens? So that's something that we talk a lot about, right, is how engagement is community engagement is a strategy through which your campuses do all of these things, right? So curious where the energy lies on your campus or where you see it within the field, that community engagement and thus the reward of faculty who do this work, how can that be how can we as a field follow that energy into the coming years?
I think it's such a smart question. I mean, you know, so the executive team and Chancellor at Rutgers Newark is very clear. We are an anchor institution, period, full stop. And we're one of the most diverse campuses in the nation and have been for the last 30 years. And one of the things that energizes that executive team and the faculty is recognizing the opportunity that we have to make these educational opportunities better for students, right? To enhance the sense of agency of the faculty who are doing their work so that they, you know, understand its utility, you know, for their own health, for the health of their communities, for their colleagues. You know, what does it mean, you know, to just be more honest about our work? You know, Dr. Donahue mentioned a little bit ago, and he clicks on some articles by mistake. You know, listen, you know, how many people read your article? No, seriously, I don't mean your mother. Like, how many people read your article? And listen, I'm behind. I hope nobody I owe an article right now is on here, but I'm always doing that work. That's important. But, you know, to your point, Lauren, about where the energy is, I mean, that energy animates the work and gives us opportunities to have it show up and to really manifest what being an anchor institution looks like and what it means and how it contributes to, you know, our phenomenological strength at these institutions. I think it's a really important challenge and question to us. Thank you for raising it.
Just thinking about energy, I do love that question as well. And I don't know that there's just one energy. There's a couple different energy flows going on. So in terms of thinking about, you know, this conversation around tenure and promotion, community engaged scholarship, I think there's a lot of energy on this campus that's very mission driven. And I mentioned that before. This idea that the work we do is related to our Jesuit mission of cur personalis, thinking about the whole person, that it's about educating students to be for others. I feel like if you were to ask people on this institution, like, why are you here, both staff and faculty, they actually invoke that language. It's like really meaningful. And so there is something about having that kind of shared language that I feel it might be unusual in higher ed. I don't know that I've seen it in a lot of places, but when you find it, it's really valuable and I think contributes to then sustaining the energy we need to do this work. At the same time, when I was thinking about energy, the first thing I thought is, God, I'm tired. And maybe it's just because it's earlier on the East Coast than for my, or earlier on the West Coast than for my East Coast colleagues here. And so I think there is something about this moment too, of trying to sustain this energy in moments where, you know, I've been in higher ed for over 30 years. I can't remember a year where I didn't hear about budget cuts. So in one sense, like that's a constant. On the other hand, there is something about, you know, just seeing so many young faculty who are on term contracts or year-to-year contracts and thinking about like, how engaged are they going to get in community work, knowing like, why might I not be here next year? And do I really want to extend an invitation to the community to work with me and partner with an institution when in fact, I might not be here next year? So the energy is kind of a both and thing.
If to build on that, and this will be our final question. So we know that we're talking about some of the context, some of the challenges, but that you all have been strong mentors. And there are a lot of folks on this call who have administrative roles, faculty leadership roles. And so would love to hear any ways that you have coached or mentored other faculty. And what do you want faculty and administrators to think about in supporting each other on that journey? Let's end with thinking about how we can support each other and ways that you have done that.
Two things real quickly. One is this. I'm always mystified that the people that have the most agency on campus, tenured faculty, seem to carry the most cowardice. Step up, man. I mean, you're like you're tenured, right? So, but I think the process like beats folks down, right? And they don't feel the sense of agency, right? And so, Dr. Garvin, this question about mentoring is critical, right? You know, how is it that we systematically, from the beginning, embrace faculty and help them not hear so much of what Dr. Donahue heard about, well, you probably shouldn't do this, you know, if you're going to survive, right? How do we, you know, work with department chairs and provosts so that, you know, initial offer letters, you know, have certain kind of language in it that help them understand that we're serious about this work? I mean, you know, one institution that I worked with did a letter, flirted with the idea of a letter of expectation that could be modified, right? Because you don't know how long it's going to take to engage the community partners. I mean, if we're serious about it, nothing should be started unless we're thinking about being together for 25 years. But right, I mean, so it's like those kinds of things. I think, again, I return to humanity, you know, approaches that manifest within, you know, faculty learning communities and, you know, bringing folks together around, you know, the methodology out of the humanities, the story circles and that kind of thing, that kind of cultural organizing, you know, community organizing, but flavored with cultural approaches that, you know, Leslie, that make them feel like, you know, we're building together. We're going to be, you know, we roll together in community, and that has always been important to me. And I've seen gains when that sort of mindset is engaged.
Thank you, Tim. Dave?
Just be really brief and echo Tim, be brave. I mean, that was going to be, we were asked to come up with some parting wisdom, and I think that was going to be my nugget, so to speak, to not be afraid. That I think this is a moment, and I think, you know, we can be making this case. And I have always found that when I am arguing why community engaged scholarship is valuable, rigorous, needed, impactful, people understand. And so I just think getting out of this mindset that it's a problem is really important.
Thank you. Emily, the final word.
I think when I'm talking to folks, I often ask them about their story and why they're doing this work. And so again, in the study that we did of the 21 faculty, the reason why people do this is super personal. It's their family upbringing, it's their faith, it's experiences they've had in their communities, commitments that they have to social justice. And I also encourage them to think about, so why are they doing this? And then also about what is their season right now? And so thinking about their career, their life as having many different seasons. And there may be a season in which you are growing and expanding and blossoming, and you are developing new relationships, and you're really invested in, growing. There are other times when you are just sustaining the existing partnerships you have, or you're generating, some new ideas, right? And it's very quiet. And there are times also for moving on to other things, right? So we also, whether it's, and it might be partnerships, but it could also just be your faculty, kind of emphasis and things that you're thinking about. And so I really think about seasons. And so it may be okay. I've talked to some folks who said, I'm really tired. And I think I would like some time just to write, right? I'd like to write about this stuff. And I feel like I never get that chance to do it. And I say, great, talk to your community partners, talk to your students, your colleagues, and let them know how you're feeling. And so I think that we forget that like our minds are connected to our bodies and our hearts and our spirits, and we're physical beings. And so self-care and finding joy and resilience is step one. And then you can start to do the work of being a partner, as a community partner, an educator, a mentor, a mentee. And so I would really think about kind of what season are you in personally? How does that help you think about what kind of engagement you can do, knowing that it doesn't look the same all the time. What you're doing, your outputs, your outcomes, your processes may be different, and that's okay. Just communicate with your people and let them know what you need. Thanks for the question, Leslie.
Thank you all. This has been so inspiring. I'm energized. Elaine?
Thanks. Thank you all. To our audience that's still with us, we believe in reflection. So I'm just going to do a simple prompt in the chat. If you can maybe share one thing you're taking away from this very rich conversation. I knew when we were, even before we were planning this and thinking about who we wanted to have on our panel, I knew this was going to be an exciting, rich, and positive conversation. It was a very holistic conversation to me about many different facets about this work and this topic. And so, as I said at the beginning, this is the beginning of a conversation. We're recording it for those of you who are on here, and obviously those who couldn't make it but registered. We're going to be sending you out a link, and we will eventually be putting this on our website, and we'll because to me this is a very foundational conversation, again, holistic, rich, thoughtful, and very from the heart for me, knowing all of you as I do. And just thank you, Lauren and Leslie, for such excellent facilitation of the conversation as well. So also in the chat, if you want to express your appreciation to our panelists and to my co-organizers for just a really wonderful conversation and a great way to kick off our week. So I want to say that we, Collaboratory North Carolina Campus Engagement, Lead California, we're in conversation about how we keep this conversation going. There were such excellent questions that came up on the registration forms in the chat. And so we're going to be organizing some follow-up in-person and webinar conversations to follow up from this, maybe breaking it down into more of the topic areas, maybe talking about assessment and rubrics, talking about, strategies that campuses have used. I want to make sure we're also capturing all of the links that are in the chat, and we're going to put them together on a resource page that we will send out to you as well with the link to the recording and an evaluation. So please, when you get the evaluation, fill it out so that you can give us any feedback to help shape those next conversations. We've already put in one conference proposal, so we could hopefully have a continuation of this conversation at CLDE in Boston if we get accepted. With that, I'm just going to check my notes to make sure that I didn't forget any other logistical announcements. But again, a huge heartfelt thank you to Dr. Donahue, Dr. Eatman, Dr. Janke. Really enjoyed, not only seeing you and hearing from you, but being in conversation with you all. So again, if everyone can share their thanks in the chat to our wonderful presenters, but thank you very much. And we look forward to being in touch with everyone in the future. I know we couldn't get to everything, but thank you all. And we're going to end and give you a couple minutes, hopefully in between now and your next whatever you have to do, so you can take a moment to breathe. Okay, thank you.